More than 250,000 people flooded into Cairo's main square today in the latest and the largest demonstration demanding the ouster of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak.
The shoulder-to-shoulder crowd sang nationalist songs and chanted the anti-Mubarak slogan, "Leave, leave, leave." Soldiers at the entrances of the square did not deter the crowds from entering. In fact, the army promised it won't fire on peaceful protesters. While these massive public demonstrations are designed to force a regime change in Egypt, it's believed that American diplomats are working behind the scenes to facilitate Mubarak's exit.
Joining us now in Toronto is Mohamed El Rashidy, a director of the Canadian Arab Federation. Mohamed, is there any way, in your opinion, that Hosni Mubarak can survive this political crisis?
No, there is not.
So what's the next step now? Who is going to take over? Who would the Egyptian people
Who would you like to see take over?
Who would you like to see?
Who would I like to take over? Well, I think it's very difficult to predict any time a situation like this arises. It's very fluid and it's never really wise to predict. But I think it's clear, number one, Hosni Mubarak is done. You have now, I heard you say about 250,000. It's over 2 million now in the El Tahrir Square. That's the Square of Liberation. That's what it stands for.
Wow.
And the numbers are growing. That's just in Cairo. It's all over the country. It's impossible to go back on this. In terms of what happens now, unfortunately, Hosni Mubarak is a very stubborn man. And, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. He's had it for 30 years, so he will not step down. Most people seeing this would say, well, of course he would have to step down, but he will not make it easy. He is obviously hanging on. He'll come up with different strategies to divide and conquer, if you will. At this point, he has no force he can use against the protesters. I believe in your coverage, you're aware now that the army will not take force against these people. They believe they are one and the same. And the police force that he's used for 30 years to quell the Egyptian people has been defeated, literally. They've been beaten off the streets. So now it's these individuals who are going to chart the course of their own country. The Egyptian people will choose their future. There are several individuals who are available to take over, but it's a people's movement, and that's what makes this so organic and I think very attractive for people outside of Egypt to watch this, that you see it's led by youth, it's led by every segment of Egyptian society, Muslims, Christians, women, men, whether they be secular or religious. It's very impressive. And when the time comes, the first step is to remove Mubarak, which will eventually happen. When that happens, there is a coalition in place that represents all these segments of society, and hopefully the United States can be, and Canada and other Western nations can be a positive force in that transition rather than a detraction.
Now, Mohamed, are you from Egypt?
Yes, I was born in Cairo. I've been to that square that you show many, many times.
I wanted to ask you, and I have been to Egypt as well, and I considered it one of the more moderate Arab countries, been to the Gulf, and it's a very different life. However,
yes,
for people who don't understand what it was like to be raised there and what the government of Mubarak did to the people, could you describe how he ruled that country?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very good question. The Egyptian people are very kind people. Like all other Arabs, they're very peaceful. They're not prone to violence by any means. And the proof of that is that they've accepted this oppression for 30 years. I go and visit often, and I wonder, how do people accept this type of humiliation? And clearly what we see is that the Egyptian people were willing to accept humiliation as individuals. But it has come to the point where they feel that their own country, which is so precious to them, is being harmed and being humiliated. And that is something Egyptians will not stand for.
But would you say that Egypt was more moderate, is still more moderate than most of the Arab states?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, Egypt is a very moderate country. But I think the region in its entirety is very misunderstood. And Egypt, as the leader of the Arab world, when it becomes a democracy, which is happening before our eyes, will show the world that Egypt and the rest of the Arab world are very moderate, and the people want the same things as everyone else around the world. There is really nothing to fear from the people taking control of their own destiny.
Are you not concerned, however, of a more strict Taliban-like Muslim government that could go in and replace Mubarak.
Yeah, I hear that very often. I'm glad you bring it up. The Muslim Brotherhood is what people basically refer to. And look, this is what you would call the boogeyman theory. And Mubarak has been using this to frighten the West and anyone who wants change in Egypt. That is, if I go, you're going to have extremists of one sort or another, so it's better to have me there. Well, the young people in Egypt have said enough. They've found out, they've looked around, there's no boogeyman under the bed or in the closet. They've spoken to the Brotherhood. There is nothing to fear but fear itself. Injustice cannot continue. The people can take hold of their own future. That's what they're doing. Okay. There's no fear. Look, this Muslim Brotherhood theory, for example, they are at the maximum would represent about 20% of the population. Today, they've announced, as have all the other groups, that Mr. Mohamed El Rashidy, who is very well known on the international scene, worked for the United Nations to essentially catch countries who are trying to develop nuclear weapons. So a moderate by all means, an international figure. He's going to be speaking on behalf of the majority of these groups, including the Brotherhood. There is nothing to fear in that sense.
Would you say that the newly appointed vice president of Egypt, Suleiman, he's a Mubarak confidant, would he be able to lead a transitional government, and would that be acceptable to most Egyptians?
No, it's not. And that's what Mubarak is going to do now, is the divide and conquer approach. And that is, you know, as time goes on, you have to realize the country's at a standstill. While the people on the squares and the streets are very determined, there are millions at home, elderly, ill, you know, average people who also want to go on with their life. And so he's going to want to stretch this out to put pressure on the people. And that pressure is what's going to decide, in many ways, the direction that they settle on. Number one, Mubarak has to leave. Nobody's willing to negotiate with the government until he leaves, which is a very impressive and powerful stance. It shows that these protesters now understand what they have done. They have confidence in themselves. They're not backing down. Right. To answer the Suleiman question, he's really, I mean, he's not Mubarak, but he's doing the same things as Mubarak. In terms of statements and policies. Right. He's of the same mind, the same generation. It's really not acceptable to the people. There may be something worked out in terms of a transition government, but if it is, it's going to be a very tight leash.
Mohamed, we loved having you on today. I hope you can come back again just to explain the situation there and what might happen, just to see those hundreds of thousands, millions of Egyptian people yes. Rallying together is quite something. Mohamed El Rashidy is the director of the Canadian Arab Federation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, guys.